Hi everybody, this is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to do another episode in my series on the King James Bible. This is the book by Alistair McGrath. It's really quite a very scholarly book and explains the whole history and the details of the production of the King James Bible. So we're in chapter 2 and we have here the rise of English as a national language. Now, in the early 14th century, French and Latin were the predominant languages that were spoken in England. Now then, the language of the peasants was always still English, but the nobility, in two sorts of nobility here, we have the nobility of the landed gentry and of the crown and all of the attendants of the crown. They spoke French, okay? But the church spoke predominantly Latin. And so we have this tremendous diversity in the country. We have the governing body, the government effectively, speaking French. We have the church preferring Latin. And of course the universities of Cambridge and Oxford also preferred Latin. And then we have the ordinary people, the peasants, and they're speaking English. We'll go into this a little bit more detail later. It's very interesting that Alistair McGrath talks here about English being good enough for spreading dung on the fields. He's a great scholar, this dear brother, but he's not a historian in every sense. Nobody ever spread dung on the fields until after the Second World War. So he's quite a number of hundreds of years incorrect on that. So the question really is all about the English language. And Queen Elizabeth I's navy and armies had established England's military credentials. Her poets and playwrights and translators had propelled English into the front rank of the living European languages. And the King James Bible consolidated the enormous advantages in the English language over the centuries. And it can be seen as a symbol of a nation and a language that believed that their moment had finally arrived. Now, let me give you a little quote here. This is a quote from, who is the man now? It's a quote from George Putnam. George Putnam declared that English was just as sophisticated as Greek or Latin and preferably capable of expressing the full range of human emotions and thought. He says, and if the art of poetry be still appertaining to utterance, why may not the same be with us as well as with them, our language being no less copious, pithy, and significant as theirs, and our conceits the same, and our wits no less to devise and imitate than theirs were. So he's contrasting himself between the European language, between France and Spain and Italy, and he says, English is as good as any of the languages on the continent. Now, to write in English or to translate into English was actually a political act. You see, the nation had been conquered. In 1066, the nation was conquered by the Normans, by the French Normans, and they brought French into England. And 300 knights were able to subdue the whole country, and that meant it wasn't the ordinary French; it was the Normandy French, a variety, a dialect of French, that was the language of politics. And it's very interesting that in the 15th century, a German Bible was published in Strasbourg in 1466. And this brought about an explosion of translations, a literal explosion of translations. However, they were all based upon the Latin Vulgate text. Following that, there were, by 1483, there were 9 printed translations accessible, all European. Martin Luther's German translation of the New Testament in 1522 was built upon the solid foundation stretching back for 2 generations. French Bibles were available by 1500, and the translation of the Bible into English in whole or part still remained illegal under the decree of 1408, known as the Constitutions of Oxford. So the triumph of French and the medieval neglect of English. Now, the English language went through a period of severe neglect in the Middle Ages. The conquest of England by the Normans in 1066 had led to the suppression of English in public life. French, or as we call it now, Anglo-French, that arose after the Norman conquest dominated public discourse and particularly government departments and courts. And the English upper classes spoke Anglo-French as a matter of principle to distinguish themselves from the lower classes who spoke in Middle English. It's a very similar thing happened in Russia, where the Russian nobility of the 19th century preferred French to their native Russian. Now, the widespread perception that French had established itself as the lingua franca of the cultural elite of Europe inevitably led to English being dismissed as a backward and a crude language. French was the language of choice by all of the elite, but the form of French that was spoken in the 13th century was a dialect associated, as I said a moment ago, with Normandy. The form of French spoken in English, became eventually the subject of ridicule in cultured French society. And so, aware of this, the English gentry would send their children to be educated in Paris to avoid the indignity of being thought crude and unrefined by the arbiters of cultural sophistication. Now, there was another great turning point in the 15th century, and we're going to talk about that now. In the reign of Henry V, it's often seen as marking a turning point in securing new respectability for the English language, and the military defeat of the French armies at Agincourt mirrored a corresponding cultural defeat of the French language in England. That military victory that would prove to be short-lived, the linguistic victory proved, however, to be permanent. And the same Henry V, who vanquished the French at Agincourt, began the trend of using the English language in his letters. The Guild of Brewers in London, probably dated from 1422, in which they formally declared that their guild would conduct all of their business henceforth in English and not French, following the example of the King and Parliament. Now, let me just digress a moment from this book here. There's another little thing that we need to understand. I don't know whether this comes up later in the book, I can't remember. But at this particular time, there was 2 popes. There was a pope in Lyon and there was a pope in Rome. And both of the popes sought great amounts of funds from the English peoples. Now, this fund that they sought to make, it was a sort of a tribute, and it was a sort of a tithe of the whole country. It was vast sums of money. And because there were 2 popes, they both demanded having the full amount each. And this was a great trial to the English. And so this began a general feeling of dissatisfaction with the Roman Church. And eventually it led to the king. I can't remember which king it was, I'll remember later. The king standing in Parliament and opening Parliament for the first time in 400 years in English. And that caused a great transformation in culture and also in fashion. It became fashionable to speak in English. Now, the Hundred Years' War, which was from 1337 to 1552, served to consolidate the growing popular impression that French was the language of England's enemy. This is the great thing that happened. First of all, the whole country turned against Rome, primarily, but they also turned against France in particular. In Shakespeare's play of Henry VI, Part 2, the phrase that became stuck in the English mind was, "He can speak French, and therefore he is a traitor." Now you see the general feeling. Now the French defeat of a larger English army at Fourmignon in April 1450 marked the end of any serious possibility that England might retain its French possessions. What happened was that the English army was completely wiped out by the French. They managed to find an answer to the longbow, and they used cannon. And they also found an answer to infantry. They used heavy horse cavalry. And these two great things were the thing that brought about the English defeat. And England lost all of her French territory in France. So this became an exceptionally important feature in the story of the English language. Now, up in York, which is the north of England, Yorkshire, there came a new culture, there came a new development. They were what was called the Passion Plays. And these were plays put on, but they were plays that acted out the whole of the Bible story. So, for example, they acted out creation, and they went all the way through and acted out the Last Judgment. They had the scenes of the life of Christ. They had it's very interesting that each of the different guilds funded different parts of the plays. So, for example, the marriage at Cana in Galilee, in which water was turned into wine, was entrusted to the Guild of Vintners, and the Last Supper to the Guild of Bakers, and the death of Christ to the Guild of Butchers. You know, this is quite strange if it wasn't so ironic. So the impact of the mystery plays was immense. Interestingly enough, even though the plays were slightly grotesque and not really based upon the scriptures, they were nevertheless of great interest to the people of the country. And so after quite a long time, it became a common expression. Why was the Bible not available in this manner? Why can't we have the Bible in English? And so English was the great question of the day. We'd got everything else in English. We got the Passion Plays in English, and so on. Opposition to translating the Bible into English rested on real fears that the English peasantry might be encouraged to rise above their masters. And of course, additional taxes in 1381 captured, because of additional taxes, the peasants captured London and beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury. And this caused all of the nobility to be petrified of the advancement of the peasants. They didn't want them to become intelligent. They didn't want them to be able to read. They didn't want them to have a Bible in their own language. and Thomas Arundel, Archbishop of Canterbury in 1407, said, "We therefore legislate and ordain that nobody shall from this day forth translate any text of Scripture on his own authority into English or any other language, whether in the form of a book or a pamphlet or a tract, and that any such book, pamphlet, or tract, whether composed recently or in the time of John Wycliffe or in the future, shall not be read in part or whole in public or in private." So you can see they're taking extreme action to prevent the scriptures becoming English. So English thus became the language of the religious underground. And to write in English was tantamount to holding heretical views. Even as late as 1513, John Colet, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, was suspended from his position because he translated the Lord's Prayer into English. At a much later time, the same man did a lot of other things. He created lots of plays, and he created a sort of a book that characterized the Bible, but it wasn't actually the Bible. So, for example, it was pure fiction. There was a tremendous amount of speeches by Mary, the mother of the Lord Jesus, nothing at all to do with what was historically correct. But because it wasn't the Bible, nobody could touch him. Okay, so this was the circumstances, and England's two great universities, Oxford and Cambridge, remained completely devoted to Latin as the lingua franca of academic life. It was the language of study, and it was the language of scholarship. Now, just bear in mind, we all know about Erasmus. Erasmus was not theologian. He was the translator that translated the Bible from Latin back into Greek. So very famous for that. But he, all his life, spoke no English, never spoke English, and was able to spend his time in Oxford and Cambridge speaking only in Latin as the medium for conversation and for his lectures. And the academic world was thus the last bastion of Latin in England. And even the Church of England had abandoned the use of Latin by 1540. So the great thing that brought about the next huge change in England would be the Reformation. And we'll talk about that on our next episode. Well, we wish you every blessing and look forward to catching up with you next time. Bye for now.